To travel to space requires the highest ambition, but to have a space race requires a set of bitter rivals whose ambitions simply must be satiated. There were two players in Earth's great space race, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Now in the 21st century, only America still stands as it was, while the Soviet Empire has faded into history. But everything that the Soviet Union was would be inherited by another nation of high ambition, Russia. From the Soviet space program's brightest minds to its proven spacecraft to its plans for a bigger and bolder future, all of it has been handed down to Russia and fused with a new generation of Russian theorists, engineers and cosmonauts, all working to ensure that the great spacefaring dream lives on. But here in the 21st century, Russia's space program is at a turning point. Soon to bid farewell to a famous international mission and forced to balance its extraterrestrial aims with the ambition and folly of its leaders here on Earth, there are no guarantees of just where Russia's space program will go next. In fact, there are no guarantees that the next decade of Russian spaceflight or the next after that will be able to live up to the legacy it was given to uphold. Today we'll be taking a close look at the Russian space program, its present, its future, and the grand question of whether it can still thrive or whether it will simply struggle to live on. Ever since the early 2000s, Russia's space program has been a centerpiece of the country's attempts to build back after the fall of its predecessor. After a decade of financial crisis back on Earth forced Roscosmos, Russia's national space corporation, to pinch pennies and survive as well as it could, the turn of the century saw a renewal of fortunes for Roscosmos and the people who made it. Starting in the year 2000, Russia participated in missions to the International Space Station, something Roscosmos has done almost uninterrupted ever since. Roscosmos was able to launch scientific missions again. It participated in international joint efforts to create new spacecraft and telescopes, and it was finally able to begin updating old Soviet-era equipment that had been putting its cosmonaut crews at risk. It was even handed a public relations victory by its one-time rival, the United States, after America's space shuttle was retired and American astronauts spent years relying on Russia's Soyuz space capsule before the SpaceX Crew Dragon was ready to take its place. But as we'll see throughout today's episode, the state of the Russian space program is inextricably linked to Russian affairs on Earth. As a result, it probably shouldn't be a surprise that over the last decade or so, the Russian space program has come under increasing strain. Roscosmos was already plagued with reliability issues before Russia invaded the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea back in 2014, with Russian economic planners, even before the invasion began, emphasizing that the space program was in need of massive reforms. Roscosmos, back then a state agency, was dissolved in 2016 and reformed into the corporation that it is today. But by 2016, the world was already holding Russia at arm's length. Russia's suite of new rockets weren't coming along nearly as well as the Kremlin had planned, and within a couple more years, Russian President Vladimir Putin had taken to calling for his officials to, quote, drastically improve the quality and reliability of space and launch vehicles. The same year Putin made that particular statement in 2018, Russia's head financial auditor found that Roscosmos was losing more money to corruption, theft, and mismanagement than any other public enterprise in Russia. In 2020, Russia pulled out of the NASA-led Lunar Gateway project to establish a lunar orbital spaceport, and in 2021, it announced that it would leave the International Space Station program in 2024. By the time Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began here on Earth in 2022, Roscosmos appeared to be an organization grasping at straws. Although Russia had signed on to the China-led effort to create a moon base, that project wasn't expected to produce a ready-to-use base until the mid-2030s at least, and when Russian troops marched on Kiev, Roscosmos was hit by a round of Western sanctions that had made the prior sanctions they'd been enduring since the Crimea affair began look like child's play. Now, sophisticated, internationally manufactured technologies and pieces of hardware were beyond Russia's space program's reach. It was iced out of deals with the European Space Agency and the satellite connectivity venture OneWeb. The space program was deprioritized and has been deprioritized again and again ever since. The government is simply straining to pay for a war that it didn't expect to last nearly this long. Roscosmos launched fewer and fewer rockets, reported steeper and steeper financial losses, and completely lost out on most of the lucrative international contracts that it had relied on for years. But nowhere in that long list of vital assets that were ripped away from Roscosmos was its ambition. And in fact, finding itself between a rock and a hard place, Roscosmos fell back on a tried and true public relations approach that the Russian Federation knows very well. One thing about the modern Russian government in its affairs back on Earth is that when things are going wrong, it loves to throw a wonder weapon at the problem and see what happens. Russia's bumbling aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, can't get out of dry dock. But never fear, Russia is building a brand new one, and it's called the Storm. Russia's main battle tanks are getting their tops blown off. Never fear, Russia's got a new super tank, and it's called the Armata. Russia's stealth fighter is showing up in photographs so visibly poorly constructed that the entire defense world is laughing. Well, never fear, Russia's got an even better fighter coming next, and it's called the Checkmate. Never mind that none of them are on the battlefield yet. Best to start quaking in your boots now, because when they arrive, the Western world is in big trouble. In a Russia at war, its space leader Roscosmos took a long, hard look at its own predicament and decided to take a page from the War Machine's book. The Russian space program might look like it's on its last legs, but it was about to turn the whole world's expectations upside down. Roscosmos and the Russian government have given the world no shortage of promised programs, promised innovations in science and technology, and promises to break every barrier they can find. Some of those promises are perhaps a little more credible than others, but as we go through Russia's offerings on tap, we'll leave that for you to decide. First, there are Russia's goals for its manned spaceflight missions, where at least for the coming few years, citizens of the Russian Federation are highly likely to maintain a presence in orbit. Despite having threatened numerous times that it would pull out of the International Space Station program, Russia has since agreed to remain a part of the program through 2028, just 3 years ahead of the ISS's planned decommissioning. Russia will continue sending cosmonauts to join Canadian, European, Japanese, and American ISS staff alongside expected spacefarers from Australia, India, and elsewhere. But although Russia will disengage from the ISS and will, like the rest of the world, lose the opportunity to use the ISS shortly afterward, the nation has made it clear that it plans to go it alone with a future space station. Speaking in 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin said that the first segment of a planned new orbital station, envisioned exclusively for Russian use, will be in orbit by 2027, a deadline that Russia now has barely 3 years to meet. According to both Putin and the leader of Roscosmos, the goal is to build a space station that can, quote, consider all advanced achievements of science and technology and have the potential to take on the tasks of the future. That's Putin speaking there, whereas the leader of Roscosmos offered, quote, if we don't start large-scale work on creating a Russian orbital station in 2024, it is quite likely that we will lose our capability because of that time gap. Over the course of the last year, Roscosmos has somewhat tempered those expectations for an imminent space station, now suggesting that the core of the planned orbital station, made up of 4 modules on a central hub, should be ready in orbit by 2030. The first of the 4 modules, the so-called Scientific and Energy module, will launch in 2027. 3 more will be grafted on by 2030, and an additional 2 more will be sent up over the following 3 years. Referred to as the Russian Orbital Service Station, or ROSS, the station is expected to operate at a 400-kilometer altitude above the Earth's surface, and it'll be positioned close to the North Pole, allowing it to both spend a lot of time observing Russia and to be more easily reached from Russia, thus expanding the range of possibilities for experimentation there. Russia currently intends to staff the exterior of the station with multiple maintenance and assembly robots, and to surround it with a small swarm of satellites launched direct from the station itself. Unlike the ISS, ROSS is expected to operate autonomously most of the time, with cosmonauts coming up every so often to check things out, wrap up ongoing experiments, and set up new ones. Then there's Moscow's lunar ambitions. In 2023, Russian state media made global headlines by claiming that Russia intends to land cosmonauts on the moon within the next decade, making the first successful Russian lunar landing in history. Their broader intent, though, isn't just to reach the moon, but to build a base there, starting in 2031 at around the same time that the basics of the ROSS space station should be complete. The Russian lunar mission hopes to finish up construction work on the lunar base by 2040 at the latest, and will be followed by operations to exploit the moon's natural resources, as well as carrying out scientific objectives. Russia's lunar ambitions did suffer a setback in that same year when its Luna 25 spacecraft crashed on the moon rather than landing as expected, but several upcoming lunar missions are already slated to take place before the end of the decade. Russia also continues to collaborate with China around its planned International Lunar Research Station, a large-scale base for scientific experimentation. Alongside fellow founding partner China, Russia hopes to build a lunar base that can support regular lunar landings and departures, facilitate lunar exploration, station, and if Russia has its way, integrate Russian-made nuclear power to keep the lights on. China hopes for the base to be built by 2035. Along with that effort, Russia plans to develop a nuclear-powered so-called space tugboat made to ferry cargo from lunar to Earth orbit and vice versa. And on the subject of new spacecraft, Russia has promised far more than an intergalactic nuke tugboat in the coming years. At the top of its list is Oral, a supposedly new generation, partially reusable crewed spacecraft that will carry between 4 and 6 cosmonauts to Russia's new space station, the Moon, and perhaps even one day Mars. Intended to come in both robotic and crewed versions, the first launch of Oral is planned for 2028. It's intended to be able to remain habitable for up to 30 days in free flight and stay docked with space stations for up to a year, doubling the abilities of Russia's current Soyuz crew capsule. Also coming soon, according to Russia, is the Angara A5, a heavy lift rocket that can boost 24.5 metric tons to an orbital altitude of 200 kilometers. Its basic A5 version has undergone several test flights in the last decade, and future iterations are said to include a version that could boost the Oral capsule to orbit, another with a hydrogen-based stage that could get up to 40-ton payloads to orbit, and perhaps even heavier lift versions after that. The upcoming Amur rocket, alternately known as the Soyuz 7, is meant to take over for Russia's current Soyuz 2, or once it goes into service, purportedly around 2028, offering a cheaper way to get payloads of under 10.5 metric tons into orbit. The Yenisei super heavy lift rocket is apparently also on the way, able to get no fewer than 103 metric tons to space and get 26 metric tons into a translunar injection path by which it could reach the Moon. The Yenisei will enable Russia to bring its expected lunar base modules into space, a mission that no other Russian rocket can accomplish. Russia's plans for bigger and better things don't just stop once you leave orbit either. Here on Earth, Roscosmos plans to move to a new headquarters in Moscow with the hope of bringing all the various entities that contribute to Russia's space agency under one roof. Along with Roscosmos, the headquarters will be home to Moscow's mission control, and it'll host 18 other companies on the premises for a total of about 20,000 employees at the heart of a special zone of the city called Technopolis Moscow. Housed in a high-glass tower rising 20 meters above the surrounding neighborhood, Roscosmos' new home should begin handling operations by next year at the latest. And finally, there's the military element, where American politicians in Washington have alleged that Russia wants to have a new super-secret space weapon circling above all of our heads. The news broke in February 2024, when a high-ranking American congressperson and chairman of the House of Representatives Intelligence Committee urged the president to declassify a, quote, serious national security threat about a soon-to-be deployed Russian nuclear space weapon. Early fears were concentrated around the idea that such a weapon could position nuclear warheads in orbit, ready to crash down on Earth, or would be powered by nuclear energy and fulfill some destructive function in space. But since then, expert opinions have come to near unanimous agreement that it's actually going to be a space-based anti-satellite weapon that could use nuclear blasts and electromagnetic pulses, or EMPs, to potentially disable hundreds of satellites at once. And that alleged secret weapon isn't the only implement of destruction that Russia has allegedly sent to space. When another space weapon was apparently launched by Russia in May of 2024, US reports suggested that it was a satellite that could attack other satellites in low Earth orbit. Deployed in the same orbit as US spy satellites, the Russian satellite is apparently able to fly close to those spy satellites, monitor and inspect them, and potentially destroy them via launched projectiles or directed energy weapons like lasers. A CNN report suggested that it could knock out satellites with an electromagnetic pulse, perhaps generated via nuclear detonation. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, Russia may already have several other similar satellites in orbit. Russia never acknowledged the satellite, dismissing the reports as fake news, and it's not 100% clear that America's intelligence is ironclad, but it is proof positive that at least in terms of weaponry, Russia's space ambitions are nowhere near satisfied yet. Now, although Russia certainly has a long list of ideas and upcoming initiatives, we've got to emphasize that there's no guarantee that any one project or proposal can work, and that it's considerably less likely that all of them will. That's not just a knock on Russia either. Space is hard, it's really hard. And whether it's the US, China, the European Union, India, or any other major spacefaring nation, failures are not uncommon. So with an eye to the real difficulties inherent to all space projects, and perhaps some further attention to the particulars of Russia's situation, it's time to ask the question: can Russia's space ambitions actually be realized in the coming years? Perhaps one of the most reliable ways to come to an answer would be to use Russia's prior behaviors as a predictor of future outcomes. And in that regard, things aren't encouraging. Russia's space program isn't dead by any means, but it's slowed way down relative to the United States, launching just 60 satellites in 2023 against America's more than 2,200. China, too, far surpasses Russia in that regard, and India is on pace to surpass it in just a few years. Not to mention the financial strains of Russia's war in Ukraine, which has led Roscosmos and associated space missions to be deprioritized, while the Western contracts that fueled Russia's once lucrative launch business aren't appearing as if they're going to come back. The money that used to come from that launch business and be funneled into research and development is now gone. Russia has long relied on advanced electronics and industrial equipment that it could only procure from Europe and the US, and it's relied on human labor that's now fighting and quite probably dying in the muddy trenches of Ukraine. The status of many of Russia's ongoing projects isn't encouraging either. Take, for example, its GLONASS satellites, a swarm meant to provide GPS coverage across Russia. Not only are those satellites nearly all past the end of their service lives, but they're not functioning well either, and aren't likely to be replaced anytime soon. Meanwhile, that Angara A5 rocket we mentioned earlier isn't in production yet. It's still undergoing testing, but it's largely outdated technology. The NSI Super Heavy Lift rocket program was stopped for years, while the corporation responsible for building the Oral capsule has had over 10 years to do it, but is still almost half a decade away from a maiden launch. For a nation suffering those issues, it's a difficult sell that higher ambitions like a Russian space station, a Russia-only moon base, or resource-extracting nuclear tugboat can materialize anytime soon. Everything about Russia's current situation would suggest that these sorts of efforts are becoming less achievable and not more so. But it is important to emphasize that for Russia, and especially for the egos of Russia's leaders, simply disengaging from space entirely is not an acceptable outcome. While some elements of Russia's grand ambition can be downsized and otherwise adjusted, some things appear very, very difficult for Russia to compromise on. That includes its capacity for manned space flights and its military space program. And at least for now, Russia's successes appear to match those most important ambitions. The Amur rocket appears to be on a decent track toward operational status, and although the Soyuz space capsule Russia relies on is now rather old, it's also got a proven service record and is regarded as one of the more reliable space capsules in history. For Russia to extend its manned spaceflight capabilities after its 2028 disengagement from the International Space Station program, that's not going to be the difficult part. If Russia wants people to go to space, Russia can get people to space just fine. The problem is figuring out where to put them once they're in orbit, and it's for that reason that Russia's purportedly upcoming space station is likely to take paramount importance. It'll be very difficult for Russia to build the entire 6-segmented structure that the nation's planners have drawn up, but building a substantially smaller station, perhaps consisting of just 1 or 2 segments for now, may be a technical objective that's still within Russia's grasp. That'll be substantially easier if Roscosmos is true to its word that the station wouldn't need to be continually inhabited, but instead just checked on from time to time. Of course, it's not clear that Russia could scrape together the materials and technologies to build a truly modern space station, but this is a nation with a history of building and maintaining its own independent stations, and could probably do it again. Getting the components to space is another matter, and one that will require Russia to field a heavy-lift rocket, despite having no heavy-lift rocket program that appears to be on even a decent track. But with luck, and with significant other areas of ambition cut away, it might be possible to build enough heavy-lift rockets to make a modest space station happen. On other fronts, Russia is likely to stay engaged with the China-led effort to establish an international moon base. After all, that's a mission where Russia can basically stamp its seal of approval, but rely on China to do the bulk of the financing and technological development. Russia could certainly contribute in mathematical and theoretical areas, help out with design elements, and use its geopolitical sway to gather human laborers from third nations that might be inclined to participate. That way, Russia does get to the moon on a Russian co-branded effort, just not on Russia's dime. But any hopes of a fully Russian moon mission probably won't survive the budget cuts to come, and any resource extractions will probably have to be part of the China-led effort, if they happen at all. Redundant objectives, like building 2 heavy-lift rocket types when one would do the trick, will probably fall by the wayside too. Meanwhile, it appears that Russia's military space program's doing fairly well, at least by comparison, and retains the ability to start fielding new sorts of satellites and weapons. While some key objectives, like getting a better GPS system or developing advanced communication satellites are probably not achievable under Western sanctions. Other objectives, like strapping a nuclear power source onto a satellite, probably are. With Russia slowly but decisively moving its entire economy onto a war footing, military space objectives like that could even become easier to achieve, not harder, and at least in a limited sense. Some of the benefits there could cross over to the civilian space program too. Across Europe and the US, experts have a range of prognoses for the future of Russia's space program. Some expect it to continue faltering, some expect it to deteriorate further, and some expect it to collapse entirely. Very few, if any, expect it to rebound. Our non-expert assessment, based on that range of expert assessments, is that a complete collapse is not terribly likely, but the lean years for Russia's space program have officially begun. Success, by the metric Russia has aspired to for so long, is unlikely. But redefine what success would mean for Russia, and even if the next few years are difficult, they won't have to be the end. Thanks for watching.